Representative Brady.
Hello.
To our lovely committee.
Thank you.
I think we're all starting to feel a little wild at this point in the week. But H46, we had that joint hearing with you all.
Yes.
We've had a bunch of other conversations about school construction, and now we have this bill in front of us. But I feel like it's been a little while since we last thought about it. So if you could catch us up on your committee's thinking, I'd appreciate it.
You sort of walk us through the bill or
I
no?
was going to do that. If you could just tell us like what you all were thinking and why you did this, that would be great.
So we had two parts to the bill basically for 486. And the big one is the exciting, I think, Education Committee thinks, part, forward-looking, to really think about school facilities statewide. Our students can't afford more interruptions. Our schools can't close again, and students need and deserve healthy learning environments. And we're going to be better off as a state if we do that in a coherent way instead of a community by community way. We put a moratorium on state aid for school construction in 2008. So this has been in place for quite a while. Needs have continued to accumulate. So the major part of this bill is creating the school construction aid task force to move us forward. If we go back a little bit, we passed Act 72 last session, knowing that we needed to get a better understanding of school facilities. Now we will have that information this fall. This would be setting up a very strategic task force to then put us in a place to use that information so it doesn't just sit on the shelf, and be prepared to actually hopefully reinstate a robust school construction. We would like to think of it as school transformation program in Vermont. And we're really, as you folks know, because you were in that testimony too, hearing from other states, particularly Rhode Island, that has some similarities to us, I think really spurred our thinking about how best to do this. The Senate Education Committee has also been working on this a lot, so that we end up in a place where we have some kind of strategic incentives in place through this task force, that when we then go to do school construction funding, we're doing it in a strategic way. We're incentivizing behaviors that we want to incentivize. Maybe that's energy efficiency, it may be a lot of things, but that we're in a place to do that. So creates the task force, funds the task force, and puts them on a pretty aggressive timeline so that they can come back to us next year in January with a plan that then we would hopefully, as a General Assembly, act on. The second part of the bill is to fold existing work around PCBs into this larger plan around school construction and school transformation, because it's proving very unwieldy and probably going to be very expensive to do that in isolation or separate from a robust statewide school construction plan. How much specifics do you want on section 2? And
Section 2, we have lots of curiosity. I think section 1, I felt like we've all been on the same journey together. Section 2, yes, I'd love to hear more about.
Well, I think most importantly, we feel like these have to go together.
Absolutely.
Section 2 is already out there on its own. And I think creating a lot of instability in our schools. If you haven't, you can get robust testimony very quickly from districts about their concerns, and some of their, a couple schools who've been through some really tough situations already because of Section 2. So that's why, Section 2 and considering PCB, any program around PCB testing or remediation, we think has to be in the context of a bigger school construction facilities plan.
I really appreciate, at the December sort of briefing, joint briefing, I asked, please make sure that these two things are considered together. And then we had testimony, and I asked, please make sure these two things are considered together. And I was told basically the way that you have constructed it, legislature, that is not possible.
Yeah.
And so I appreciate that you are moving us back to bringing those two issues together. Thank you.
In fact, somebody from AOE said to us, if we're moving along with school construction in a really thoughtful way, PCBs are sort of like a bomb that could drop into any school and blow up thoughtful, strategic thinking, and could even have us putting a lot of money into buildings we may decide that we don't want to keep, that either we need a whole new building, the building isn't salvageable, or as we think about facility and building needs around the state, maybe there are places where we are bringing together a slightly larger middle school for better learning opportunities. So we don't want to have just put a whole lot of money into caulk and light ballast in a school that may not be open in 3 years. All right, so within section 2, I guess I'll try to hit the high points of what, or do you want to just ask?
I feel like that was probably
All right.
good.
Great.
Any questions for Representative Brady before we hear from Michael O'Grady? Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry.
That's a good question.
Let's,
That's a good, of all the things I prepared, I didn't even, last Friday was a bit of a blur. I don't even remember the count.
Except one member was missing.
But we are, yes.
what was that? I didn't hear that.
10-1-1.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Yep.
Representative Matos and then Representative Odie.
So in this, it's authorizing a grant of up to 16 million for Burlington.
Yeah.
So half of what we reserved for PCBs to give to Burlington.
Yep.
For their $97 million school.
The 16 million is specifically for the demolition and abatement, getting what they now have to do to get PCBs off of that site. So that is just for that portion of the work, since they've been significantly displaced, obviously, for a long time and incurred a lot of cost and a lot of impact on the community and on students.
Representative Odie. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I was
I'm sorry.
Was there any talk about, because it's gonna be part of a larger discussion about the PCBs, about taking over half of the money that's available for PCBs and giving it to one school district versus utilizing it throughout the state?
Well, in the whole, and Ledge Council can address this better, but in section 2, what we are proposing is, and suggesting that is at this point, we pause PCB testing, the program as it exists, and we only proceed with remediation for schools who are already engaged in on-site testing, and we don't initiate more on-site testing. We don't continue down this road that's putting us in a really precarious spot and putting kids in schools. Cabot's a great example, in a really terrible spot in terms of being able to keep their schools open. So it's not that this would be, so of that money, we're only that the 32 million now is only being spent on schools that are already engaged in on-site testing.
And my understanding is that the 30 million in the reserve that we would move out of the reserve is enough, and we can maybe hear this from Julia too, is enough money to cover the schools that already have needs that have tested, sort of approximately or close to it?
Yes, maybe. I don't know that I can speak to that, and it's going to depend a little bit on exactly how, tests come out. We know exactly what 5 districts have already had to, have already found some PCBs and had to begin remediation. None of those projects and that remediation are on the scale by any means of Burlington. But I couldn't say for sure that,
And then maybe not everyone is following Cabot's experience as closely as maybe you are. And so what's the example of Cabot?
I'll give broad strokes, and I think that the Superintendent's Association is here too, but, finding out, in this case, it was just days before school opened, that they may have elevated levels. Again, I don't want to get deep into the levels here, and I would point everybody to the 7 Days article this week, which is probably the most kind of comprehensive history of this whole story. But the levels are also different for different ages and grade levels. And so they were faced suddenly with, we were about to start school, and they were not going to be able to have certain parts of their building, their gymnasium in particular, open. And they were maybe even only going to be able to use certain parts of the building for certain ages. That might even break down within a classroom to say some kids can be impossible to communicate, let alone to execute to families of some, third graders, I'm hypothetical now, but third graders can be in this space, but only sixth graders can be in this space. And so they were in a real bind in terms of just even opening school on time, what parts of their campus and facilities they could use, and differing standards for different ages and the practicalities of doing that in a elementary school. And then having to undertake costly or be prepared to undertake costly remediation. They're now in the process in terms of applying for the grant through the e-board for the remediation work they're doing, but their superintendent, Mark Tucker, can speak. He's essentially become kind of a de facto PCB expert, which is not how our instructional experts should be spending their time, and could certainly speak to kind of what this has meant and in many ways has helped the agency and helped the state understand the program and figure out how to do some things going forward. But again, not the position that the education committee hopes we're putting superintendents and instructional leaders in if we want instructional outcomes.
Representative Odie, do you still have some, or no?
Maybe this task force will examine, evaluate, and report on issues relating to.
We haven't gotten the walkthrough yet.
Okay, well, then I did want to ask a question, which is, you have an appropriation of $200,000 from the general fund to hire a school construction expert. So I wondered if you had any discussion about hiring a school funding expert also.
Not that I can recall.
Okay.
But not that I can recall. Several of the people on the task force, you know, the number is quite small given the expertise we're asking for on this task force because we wouldn't need to pay. It would be within the purview of their jobs for most of the people on the task force. And in terms of education funding, you know, hopefully several of these members would bring expertise in that regard, but we did not talk about a separate kind of position in that way.
Representative Sims, Anthony, Maslin, and then we are going to actually hear about the bill.
So I really appreciate the challenges that Burlington is going through and Cabot. I imagine as we continue to learn more about more schools, those challenges will continue, and certainly support concept of helping communities address those challenges. So I guess I'm curious whether in discussion around intent to, as we're doing for Burlington, to ensure access to similar resources for other communities.
Well, I think that's the whole point of the school, you know, the bigger bill and part one is a school construction, school transformation program, working closely with the treasurer's office. So a different model than how we've handled school construction needs before. And I think has the opportunity to help us create a more robust program and administer a more robust program so that as we get down the line, one, we're not just doing PCB work in isolation. So if it happens in the school where my kids go, it's in the context of a larger consideration around what are our priorities for spending on physical buildings in the state. And so those schools should then be, all schools would be, you know, swept into that in terms of looking at our statewide needs and how best to utilize our money. So
I think one of the interesting things to me about like how the two things line up is, you know, PCB remediation is often about ventilation and windows and caulking of windows and all those things. And like both of those are like the two first things you would do in just a good, like a regular, very good school construction project, right? Along with septic. Representative Sims, I'm sorry to leave.
No. It
I
wasn't
think you never
that,
stopped thinking about
again.
the septic in the schools.
And that demolition is also sometimes a part of that.
Oh, God, yeah. Representative Maslin, Anthony.
On Carol, school funding expert, this is because you gotta raise so much money, this is a new consideration, or people who know more about it than your average school budget person, school board person?
Well, my thought is that looking at the Rhode Island model, if you take that idea, that model, and put it onto what we do, we are already doing something different with the way we fund education in our state. And so I'd just like to see how the formula that we have pans out for helping with construction aid versus the formula that's Rhode Island has that's recommended versus how might you put a different formula in if those two formulas didn't seem to meet, you know, our goals.
You might, just I thought, talk to Richie Westman. He handles a whole lot of the financing for VSAC and that sort of stuff. Has expertise that I certainly don't have. He may just have an idea or two or three.
I was going where I think Representative Odie and Maslin went in the sense that what I recall from the Rhode Island example had enormous advantages in terms of organizing a regime to schedule the attack of transformation. But because Rhode Island has a totally different arrangement and a universe of property compared to Vermont, the equity issues are extremely different in Vermont than they are from Rhode Island. So I share the worry that the treasurer's office or members of the task force may not be able to graft the Rhode Island model onto Vermont unless there's some expertise in the finer points of Vermont equity considerations. I don't know how you remedy that at the 11th hour, but
Well, I think that's, I mean, and we'll hear from the treasurer's office, we're going to get a really comprehensive report. And I think in the conversations we've had with Rhode Island, even we've been very clear about how different our education finance system is from theirs and how that would need to be in anything we did.
Yeah, I don't think that this bill says we have to copy the Rhode Island model. I think it's just helpful to see another state taking on some similar challenges with a similar history. So it's, and certainly we're, not likely going to carbon copy the Rhode Island model. That will be up to the task force, to really recommend. And that's going to be some really hard, but I think the education committee thinks and hopes some really important work around, transformation and looking at our system as a whole and looking at how we best invest our dollars and where we need facilities and what kind of facilities. And so that will go through the work of this task force, which has a pretty robust membership, and it will come back to us. That will be work of, a future legislature.
Yeah. And
I just say equity finance with Rhode Island is a true apples to oranges comparison. But I mean, JFO can help this group navigate that.
Thank you very much, Representative.
All right.
Really appreciate it.
I'm going to stay and listen so I hear Ledge Council's walkthrough. Again, it's helpful every time I hear it.
Hi, Michael.
Good morning. Do you want me to share the screen?
If you don't mind.
Sure. So, this is Mike O'Grady with Legislative Council. First thing I need to address is why am I here?
That's how every single time Saoirse reminds me you're the attorney on this. I'm like, I feel for it. Thank you.
So I staff hazardous materials issues, and I've had some experience in prior work doing hazardous materials work. So when the issue of PCBs came up, I was volunteered to be in committee, and the conversation largely in committee, they had, when I got there, had already agreed, I believe, on the school construction and aid task force and focused much of their discussion on section 2. So I drafted section 2 and I volunteered to follow the bill.
Thank you.
From there. So I'll just do a fairly mid-level, I guess.
Mid-level sounds perfect. Thank you.
So the first section, as you know, creates that school construction aid task force to examine, evaluate, and report on issues relating to school construction aid. Their duties and powers are fleshed out further. It's 14 members. Do you want me to go through the membership?
I think we can read along. Thank you.
Member of the House, one of the Senate, State Treasurer, Secretary of Ed, Executive Director of the Vermont National Education Association, Executive Director of Vermont Principals Association, Director of the Vermont School Boards Association, Director of the Superintendents Association, Director of the Municipal Bond Bank, President of the School Custodians and Maintenance Association, person with expertise in historic preservation, person with expertise in the construction industry, specializing in school construction, a member of the American Industrial Hygiene Association, and then the state toxicologist.
There are associations on that list I didn't know existed, so I am very impressed with the education committee on this one.
So the first thing the task force is tasked with doing is reviewing the facilities inventory and conditions assessment and school construction funding report that was required in the last session. And then study the following issues relating to school construction needs. The need, both programmatic and health and safety of school construction funding options, governance structure, appropriate state action level for response to PCBs, whether the state should continue to require testing of indoor air quality in schools for PCBs. And then the criteria for prioritizing school construction funding. Task force has assistance from Agency of Ed, Department of Health, and the State Treasurer. Treasurer has authorized a contract for services for a technical assistance for a school construction expert. They report to you January 15th, 2024, with any recommendations for legislative action, including recommendation on how the state should expend the funding in the education fund reserved for future school construction. They meet, it ceased to exist on July 1, 2024. They have 10 meetings, not more than 10 meetings. And then there's $200,000 appropriated to the state treasurer for that school construction expert. Should also be aware that there is a very similar bill coming back from the Senate, almost exact except for the state toxicologist and the directive to the task force to review whether and how to do PCB testing.
Okay.
Section 2 is, as Representative Brady noted, the testing pause on PCBs in schools. You likely all recall that in the last session that there was a requirement for Agency of Natural Resources to conduct indoor air quality testing of schools for polynated chlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, and they were appropriated $4.5 million to do so. So the first subsection notwithstands those testing requirements for A&R and directs A&R not to initiate testing for PCBs at any school in the state after the effective date of the act until the report of the School Construction Aid Task Force has been submitted to the General Assembly and the General Assembly approves further testing. So there needs to be a further act of the General Assembly after this passes to authorize continued PCB testing of indoor air quality for schools. If A&R has initiated on-site testing, because they are engaged in the testing program right now and it's on-site, so there's a couple of different stages that A&R is going through in their testing. They have a consultant that's doing the testing. They identify schools that are going to be tested. They do an assessment, they do a plan, and then they do the on-site testing. So if they are in the process of on-site testing, the agency shall complete the testing. So if they're in the pipeline for assessment and planning, they do not complete the assessment and planning. If testing of the school initiated prior to the effective date of the act indicates need for remediation or removal, because there are action levels both at the state and federal level that require response, especially certain federal action levels require significant remediation, which is partly what the issue is with Cabot, both the state action levels of tiering based on exposure to certain ages and populations versus whether or not the action level is of such a degree that it requires immediate response underneath the federal action levels. There's a grant program that's established in subsection B. So if a school that is having on-site testing right now finds that they've exceeded one of the action levels that requires remediation or removal, they can apply to the Agency of Education for a grant for the cost of that remediation or removal. And then the last sentence just clarifies if A&R has only approved a work plan or cost estimate to conduct an inventory or testing at a school, but no on-site testing, A&R shall not conduct on-site testing at that school under the authority set forth in the subdivision. The next relates to the contract and the next two subdivisions relate to the appropriation and the contract that A&R has for the testing. Any funds remaining at the end of fiscal year 2023 from the appropriation for testing shall revert to the education fund to be held in reserve for future school construction needs as recommended by the School Construction Aid Task Force. The A&R was required to report earlier this year about their testing program. One of the things they said in their report is that they're probably going to use most of the 4.5 for testing and that they're going to need more to complete testing. I don't know how much is going to be left over. There should be some, but it won't be a whole lot from that 4.5. And then pursuant to the non-appropriations clause in state contracts, every state contract is supposed to be drafted according to Administrative Bulletin 3.5, and they're all supposed to have standard terms and conditions in them. One of those terms and conditions is if the General Assembly doesn't provide the appropriations necessary to fulfill the contract, the state agency has to terminate that contract. You are taking away the appropriations from A&R that they need to fulfill this contract. So you are then directing them to terminate that contract under the non-appropriations clause. I checked with A&R. This clause is in their contract. So you're not going to violate the contracts clause of the U.S. Constitution, which says states can't impair contracts entered into between two consenting parties unless there are certain conditions. But this is a term of the contract. Non-appropriations is a valid reason to terminate this contract. And then you get to the education fund and PCB appropriations. There were $32 million that were reserved in the education fund for the purpose of investigation and remediation and removal of PCBs from schools. Those are unreserved. They're no longer just set aside for that purpose. And then the unexpended or unobligated amount of $2.5 million that was transferred by the emergency board to the Agency of Education for the purpose of PCB remediation shall revert to the education fund for further allocation. So let's talk about that. So Act 178 of 2022 appropriated $32.5 million for PCB testing and reserved that in the education fund. The E-board then took 2.5 for the immediate needs for remediation. So you are clawing back all of that money, all of that 32.5. And then in the Agency of Education, you're creating a grant program. So notwithstanding 16 VSA 4025D, which is something that Julia just informed me of last week, that if you don't spend the education fund the way that is specifically authorized, then the property tax automatically repeals. I never knew that. That was interesting.
We try not to tell too many people about that one, Michael, but thanks for mentioning it.
So notwithstanding that, so the property tax is not going to automatically repeal 29.5 and the unexpended funds identified under B2s, the unexpended emergency board funds, shall be appropriated from the Ed Fund to the Agency of Ed in fiscal year 2024 for one or more of the following. First, grants to schools that are required after A&R testing to conduct remediation or removal of PCB contamination. The grants shall be in the amount of 100% of the cost to the school for remediation or removal, including costs incurred when necessary under state or federal law to relocate students to a facility during remediation or removal. Second, eligible costs are grants to schools that have already conducted remediation or removal, but A&R was only paying 80% of those costs. The schools will get reimbursed for the 20% that they had to pay out if they've already done remediation and removal. And then last, a grant of up to $16 million to the Burlington District to reimburse the district for the demolition and removal not the construction of the new school. It's basically what they had to do to respond to the PCB contamination to address those levels. They get up to $16 million. And then to ensure that schools aren't, putting in the best Swedish windows that they can buy, the Secretary of Education, after consultation with the Vermont School Boards Association, Superintendents Association, and School Custodian and Maintenance Association, shall develop criteria for the cost of remediation and removal that are eligible for a grant. So they'll come up with criteria for what will be eligible. For example, when they did lead testing, the General Assembly said, if you have this kind of fixture, you get this maximum amount reimbursement. Can't really do that in this program because of the nature and the variability and what costs may occur, but there will be cost constraint requirements to avoid excessive spending. The act takes effect on passage.
It's okay, it's at the same time every day.
It's not when I have a meeting.
Okay. Any questions for Michael? Okay.
Oh,
Thank-
I did have one question. In the first section, let's see, page 5 here. The sum of 200,000 is appropriated from the general fund to hire. What, could we put up to 200,000?
Yes, you could. I mean, the appropriation is the amount that the treasurer gets to work with.
Oh,
The treasurer then puts out an RFP,
all right.
takes.
But we won't.
So we don't need to do that because the RFP might come in under that and then we don't. Okay. And then that, in the end, that money goes to the bottom line of the ed fund because it wasn't all expended.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, you'll have to do budget adjustment since it was appropriated to the treasurer.
All right, okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Julia. It's been a while. Or maybe that was just yesterday. I don't really know. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's been a busy week for all of us. For the record, I'm Julie Richter with the Joint Fiscal Office. Madam Chair, did you want me to share my
The screen would be great. If you would share the screen, also great. Thank you.
Okay. Make that a little bigger for folks. All right. So I know that we're a little pressed for time, so I'll say relatively high level, but let me know if you want me to get into any of the details. Michael did really set the stage well in terms of what's going on with all of the monies in and out of the education fund. So as we just saw, there's really two sections of the bill. Both sections have a fiscal impact, but I'll just go through them piece by piece. So section 1, that appropriates the 200,000 to the Office of the State Treasurer from the general fund. So that's a general fund appropriation, not an education fund appropriation, in fiscal year 2024 to hire the school construction expert to assist the task force that's created in the bill. Further, there are, as mentioned, 14 members of the task force. There's 2 from the General Assembly and the other 12 are not legislative members. Because of the way that the statute is written, if those members are serving in their ex officio roles, they may not be entitled to per diem payments and reimbursement. So we estimate that for the per diem payments and expenses for this task force, it'll be approximately $8,000. And the way that the bill is drafted, those costs will be absorbed both by the General Assembly and the state treasurers, the Office of the State Treasurer's budgets. So that's the fiscal impact of section 1 of the bill. And then section 2 of the bill, that gets into the education fund. So the bill unreserves the 29.5 million that still remains in the education fund reserve for PCB remediation. That was set aside in Act 178. That was the yield bill last year. It appropriates those funds to AOE in FY24 to provide grants to schools. So that's big picture fiscal impact. Would you like me to walk in any more detail about section 1?
I don't think so.
Okay,
I feel like Michael gave a really clear overview of it.
great. So section 2, it's really the flow of funds. So as Michael walked through, the remaining funds from the appropriation to ANR will revert to the education fund to be put in a separate reserve for future school construction projects. And then those 29.5 million are unreserved in the ed fund and then appropriated out in addition to whatever additional funds have been unobligated and unexpended that were appropriated by the board to AOE this fall. So those funds are appropriated to AOE to provide those grants, the 3 different grant buckets that we were looking at, or that were just walked through, or the 100% reimbursement, that making districts whole if they had been receiving 80% reimbursement to provide that additional 20%, and then the up to 16 million to reimburse Arlington School District. So I'll pause there if there's any questions.
No, thanks. Okay, thank you. I think someone from the treasurer's office, but I don't know, do you both want to come? You're both listed. I don't-
It'll just be me, Madam.
Great, that makes so much more sense.
So for the record, Gavin Boyles, Deputy Treasurer. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
I don't want to run through the whole bill, but just broadly, thank you for taking it up and thanks for the attention to this. It's a really important issue and a big priority of our office. I wanted to start with something that was a subject of some questions from a few representatives, which is the $200,000 appropriated for what's in the bill as a quote school construction expert. And we did want to propose a slight broadening of that language because we do think that there's a need for the sort of financial expertise that Representative Odie referred to. And so there was some language in.
We're actually so any changes to that, since it's a general fund appropriation, I'm going to ask you to amend it in appropriations, and we can, happy to help you get that language to appropriations. But for timing, for crossover, it's better that we don't amend this if possible, and any amendments happen in appropriations tomorrow.
Right. So I'll just mention then what I will propose to appropriations, just for awareness, which is that we would propose, there was some language in S-124, the Senate version of this bill, that just added "and for any administrative, technical, or legal assistance" to the task force. And I just want to
like the task force to have all of the sort of education,
Yes.
finance expertise it needs, because that's going to be one of the hardest parts of this project.
And one thing I'll highlight on that point too is that we have existing sort of hourly contracts with various professionals that may be able to just cover this work. So we would use the $200,000, but we wouldn't necessarily have to go out to a new RFP for it because these contracts are fairly broad to start with. So.
Read that language again.
Yes, what we had in the Senate version was "and for any administrative, technical, and legal assistance for the task force." And it's on the very last page of the Senate bill. But we will propose that in appropriations.
I bet Representative Brady could make sure that you connect with appropriations on that.
We would certainly support that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else you want to tell us?
Yeah, just a couple other sort of minor things. One is that given the sort of additional focus on PCB testing and reporting on that topic, we think it might be worthwhile to have a representative from ANR on the task force, which there isn't currently. So something for consideration. I know there will be a call for some reporting in particular on the PCB topic, and that is not expertise that we have in the treasurer's office. So something to consider there. And then I did want to just highlight as well that the Secretary of Education testified on the Senate side that he thought it would be more efficient to simply have a chair of the committee rather than co-chairs, and he was proposing that the treasurer be that chair. So we just wanted to reiterate that our office is fine with that construct. Obviously happy to be co-chair as well, but just wanted to mention that. And then other than that, I think that may be it. You know, the rest of it is largely the same as we've seen before. And as I said, we're very supportive of it and eager to get started.
I really appreciate the treasurer's office sort of championing this somewhat lonely effort. Really like brought us all together around a really important issue that crosses all of our communities. Thank you. Representative Anthony.
I just, my recollection in reference to your suggestion that A&R perhaps ought to participate. As I recall, one of the log jams in proceeding in a thoughtful way was the squeeze on laboratory results and if you will, the ability to keep up with the testing regime that involves multiple sites and samples and whatnot. Do I recall that the state laboratory was going to essentially gin up to be able to do the testing in state so that capacity constraint was going to be overcome? Does anybody remember?
Do you remember testimony about that from?
Okay, I just want to say that would be, it turns out, quite crucial because it'll hold up everything else if you can't get samples back.
I recall that generally.
I remember that.
Who knows who it came from? Yes, Representative Messel.
In regards to the language for approach, would you want to also include financial? I mean, administrative and various other kinds of things regarding.
Yeah, so no, it's a great point. Certainly happy to add that as well. The legal assistance that we're referring to there is probably going to be our bond counsel, who sort of have their own internal financial experts as well. But certainly happy to.
I wouldn't micromanage you, but it seemed, given what Carol was asking for, that financial would be a communication word that would be very helpful.
Great. Happy to do that.
Thank you.
That's all I've got. Thank you very much. If there's any other questions.
I don't think so. Thank you. Jeff, are you just here for the ride?
You want a motion on this?
Motions on everything today, Jen. Thank you. Oh, sorry. No, we're gonna have more conversation. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm fine. I think my comment is, I think might be a little light on the General Assembly representation. I'm not like 3, maybe 4. I wouldn't go bigger than 4, but especially since education is, there's education policy, which is done in the education committee, and education finance, which is done in the finance and ways and means committee.
I was having the same feeling,
I
Scott.
feel the same way.
That occurred to me as well with that.
Maybe we could add
A lot of
2
feelings.
people from the House and 2 people from the Senate.
I think that is.
Okay. Aaron, does that work for you? I can't see you.
I think so. If I remember right, in some testimony from the treasurer or in talking with the treasurer, I think there was also just a concern about the size of the task force.
Yeah.
And the bigger it gets, the more unwieldy it gets. And so I think that's why we erred on the side of keeping it smaller. But I don't know if I could answer.
I don't have a problem with it though.
I think Gavin Wells from the Treasurer's Office, I think that's a fair statement of the concern. And I don't know, it's certainly nothing against having additional House members, but there is just a point of unwieldiness that starts to be reached. So just a general concern, no hard cap from our perspective.
I hear the general concern. I wouldn't want to put many members, but I do. We really do bring very different expertise, and especially on education issues, the balance between finance and policy is, I think, really important if we're actually going to get something done when it comes back to the building.
I suggest that it be something like up to, and then you have some flexibility, or the chairperson does, because I really agree. In the end, this is going to come down to conflicting perspectives. And I think it would be better for clear sailing into the future if the legislature was more robustly represented. I think that's where I am.
So are folks comfortable with informally making that request to appropriations? You know, that's a little,
I would make that motion that we increase it to 4 with 2 for each line.
I'm asking if you'd be willing to do that to appropriations rather than doing it ourselves in this committee. Does that sound okay to you? Okay.
Are you going to do up to, Scott? Because I agree, 15 would be great, and you keep multiplying.
I've never seen when a task force or something got put together where there was gonna be members from the General Assembly. I've never seen that up to
Okay.
used. It just says what it is, and then the speaker and the pro tem just pick.
So Scott, does it work for you to work with Aaron? So there's gonna be one amendment that's gonna happen in appropriations. That's gonna make some changes in language from the treasurer's office and then maybe add another
Okay.
member. Does that work? Okay. Anything else that folks wanna talk about here? Okay, then a motion would be lovely.
Okay, I move we. Either one, or both, you know.
Are you making a motion, Jim?
Sorry,
Are you making a motion?
Yeah, I'm making a motion that we vote it out the way we got it.
Thank you very much.
486.
Representative Maslin moved that we find 486 favorable as it came over from the Education Committee. Representative Anthony,
Sure.
are you seconding?
Yes, I am seconding 486 as presented.
Great, so Representative Maslin moved, Representative Anthony seconded, and any further discussion? Yes, Representative Mattos.
Yeah, I can't really support the way it is with the PCB funding. That money was set aside to help with all of the testing, and now we're taking all of that money and putting it just towards what we've done so far prior to this pause. And I would love to see money left over to be able to help other schools after this next study is done, which I think has already been done in the past, but neither here nor there. I just don't think we should spend all the money on these select schools when there's gonna be more to come. When that money was intended for much broader support for schools across Vermont.
I hear you. I was uncomfortable with it at first, and then I think this money is not enough to cover all the schools around the state, and so want to sort of tackle the problems that we already dredged up, and then have the school construction larger conversation take care of the other bills. But I totally hear you. Anyone else? Okay. The clerk could please call the roll.
Andrews, yes. Anthony,
Yep.
Beck,
Yes.
Brannigan,
Yes.
Demrow,
Yes.
Maslin.
Yep.
Natos,
No.
Odie. Yes. Sims,
Yes.
Taylor,
Yes.
Canfield,
Yes.
Kornheiser.
Yes.
11-1-0.
Thank you, everyone. Done some good work today. We are going to be back here at 12:55.
Just let me know.
Yes.
To do what?
We are going to vote on H 276 as amended.